A friend of LangFest, one of the advisors.
No, I do, absolutely.
To introduce our second part of the Prodigy of the Professor, we have Mr. Krashen, and we ask Mr. Kaufman from Link to introduce our next presenter, Mr. Kaufman.
Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Is this on? Can you hear me? No. Hello? Is it on? Yes, okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce my friend, Dr. Stephen Krashen. I was at the Boston annual convention of the Teachers of Foreign Languages in the United States, which is the largest language convention anywhere, and they had all kinds of speakers, fascinating, fabulous speakers. There was only one event which you had to line up outside to get in. People were sitting in the aisles. It was packed to the gills. That was the presentation by Dr. Krashen. We are very lucky to have here a person that I consider the clearest and most to-the-point explainer of how language acquisition takes place. He understands it, he explains it with clarity, and I'm looking forward, as I'm sure you are, to the presentation. Dr. Krashen.
Thanks, Steve. And yes, I will be discussing Steve Kaufman in my talk. You have an outline? Yes, everybody got one? If you don't, too bad. No, we have more in case you need them. Okay. I want to start out by letting you know what our latest breakthrough is in the scientific laboratories of Southern California. We have done a great deal of research on this, interviewed millions of people, and we now know the answer to the question everybody asks. What is the first sentence you should know in another language? Any ideas?
Hola, I love you.
Okay, are you ready?
I don't know your language.
Wo peño wefu, my friend will pay. Dos cervezas, por favor, mi amigo va a pagar. Okay, that's the opening joke. Let me tell you what's on the handout. The handout at the top is to save you money. After it says my name, there's my website, www.sdkrashen.com. D is my middle name, David. All the articles I could put up on there, I'm putting them up as fast as I can, are there. If you want to download them, don't ask me, just do it. Weddings, bar mitzvahs, birthdays, you can share it with anyone except Donald Trump. Which brings me to my next point. My next point is Twitter. I misspelled my name here. S. Krashen, should say. I love Twitter. I like Twitter and Facebook. Twitter and Facebook are the underground. This is how we're getting information around these days. The professional journals are expensive, boring, and hopeless. They have changed. This is why I have the website, and a lot of us are doing this. And get ready to applaud me on this, okay? Articles I publish are all in open access, free journals. Okay? More and more of us are doing this. Same thing with books. Nobody can afford them anymore. So I'm putting them there, and we announce these things on Twitter, my work, other people's work, jokes, etc. My goal, you got to help me with Twitter. Please follow me on Twitter. I want to catch up to Justin Bieber. He's up to like 25 million. He's not in first place. Do you know who's in first place? Katy Perry. The rate I'm going to catch up to him in exactly 2,810 years. I'm taking folic acid and other vitamins, so I'm kind of optimistic this is going to happen. Also, today's handout is also available in expanded form, and you can look at it right now. If you have a cell phone or a little computer with you, Go to skrashenblogspot.com, and I think like the third thing on there is LangFest, and is today's handout in great detail, or print it out later and you get all the references, handouts, and the many, many quotes I'm going to go through. The Blogspot is where I put letters to the editor, etc. Going back on Twitter, I've been trying to answer Trump and Betsy DeVos every single day. They are our new president, as you probably have heard, and Secretary of Education. My goal there is to be blocked by Mr. Trump. It hasn't happened yet. The first day I did it. First day he was in office, he says, we've got to get rid of evil from the United States. And I answered and said, we're looking forward to your impeachment. I agree. What I'm going to do today is, of course, talk about polyglots and relate it to theory, language acquisition theory. Case histories, in other words. Case histories are one of many ways we do research on this. We also do experimental research, we do correlational research. I'm going to focus on case histories today. And the case histories, the main point is they are terrific for doing research. They're not anecdotes, they're real research, if you do a lot of them. Here's how science works. You have a hypothesis. I'll give you an example of a hypothesis, a linguistic hypothesis. Let's say I have a hypothesis that all languages in the world have pronouns. Okay, that's a pretty good hypothesis, right? Wouldn't you agree? Say yes. Yes, okay. Yes, sir, okay. So I've now looked at 2,753 languages, all the languages in the world, and they all have pronouns. Can I claim that the hypothesis has been proven? No. This is the way science works. Someone can always say, well, maybe there are a couple you haven't seen. Maybe there's some languages that have been lost, like Proto-Carthaginian. Maybe it didn't have pronouns. Maybe a new language will develop and it won't have pronouns. So you can't look at every case. This is true. Science is a dangerous game. Let's say I've made my career on pronouns. I've published papers, and when I go to conferences, people say, there goes the pronoun man. And I've got, my chair in pronunciation, the Institute of Pronouns, and then it happens. Some punk graduate student goes to South America and finds a language, 4 speakers all over the age of 94, no pronouns. What happens to my hypothesis? Disproven. One counterexample is enough to disprove a hypothesis. What happens to my career? How could he have been so stupid, right? When Einstein first published his theory of relativity, a book was published called 100 gegen Einstein, 100 against Einstein. 100 mediocre German physicists all wrote articles saying Einstein was wrong. When Einstein was asked about this book, he says, 100 people say you're wrong. What do you say? He said, if it were true, one would be enough, which is absolutely the way it does. This is how we're doing case histories. If we look at case histories and I have a hypothesis and I'm using it to test the hypothesis, every single case history must be consistent with the hypothesis. So I'm really asking for trouble. I'm asking for people to come up with counterexamples. And if you do, the theory is dead. The entire theory is dead. 40 years of research, waste of time. This is the way we work. Tightrope. Well, let's go through it. What are the hypotheses? We are now, let me summarize the last 40 years of work by talking about, we'll call a 40 years war. There has been a war going on for the last 40 years between 2 hypotheses, 2 views of the way we acquire language and develop literacy, and it's a very good war, because no matter which hypothesis wins, we have learned a great deal. This is all in your handout, so I'm just doing this for my own benefit. The hypothesis I think is right is the comprehension hypothesis. And the comprehension hypothesis says We acquire language and we develop literacy in one way and only one way: when we understand messages, when we understand what people tell us, or when we understand what we read. We call this comprehensible input. Here's a crucial point. If you want to acquire language with comprehensible input, first you get comprehensible input. You hear interesting stories. You have interesting conversations. You read books. The result of this are the so-called skills: grammar, vocabulary, etc. So the causality goes in this direction. The rival hypothesis, we call it skill building, says the causality goes in the other direction. First, you learn your skills consciously. You learn the grammatical rules. So you do conscious learning first of vocabulary, grammar. Then you practice the new rules in output. You produce them. And the idea is, if you do that enough, over and over, gradually it will become automatic. The learning will become absorbed and automatized. And as you're doing it, you should get your errors corrected to make sure you got the rules right. So notice the causality, I'm putting language use here, the causality is reversed, a profound difference. Problem is, with skill building, that automatic use of language never comes. It's a delayed gratification hypothesis. Work hard, someday you'll be able to use the language. The gratification never comes. In my opinion, there is not a single human being on this planet who has ever acquired language this way. The research backs up comprehensible input. I'm going to give you just part of it today. The rest of the research are comparison of methods. Methods based on comprehensible input are are always never worse than skill building and nearly always better. We have correlational studies, etc. So the research supports this one, comprehensible input. Also, comprehensible input is a lot more fun. In fact, if input is not interesting, no one's going to pay attention to it. So it has to be reasonably pleasant for it to work. Skill building is painful. For most people, it is painful. My estimate, and I'll give you some data, is that 90 to 95% of students in skill building classes hate it. About 5% like it. I found a study done here in Canada, in fact, where they found that if you guys ask students of both French and English as a foreign language, how many of you really, really like grammar? About 5%. Those are the ones who become language teachers. You see the problem. So comprehensible input is win-win. In my opinion, it's pleasant and it works. Skill building is lose-lose. It isn't very pleasant and it doesn't work. The problem is, for the public, and this includes language professionals, for most people, skill building is not a hypothesis, it's an axiom. They haven't heard of any other alternative. It's the only game in town. Now, if you believe in skill building, all the ways that we torture students in school, all the tests that we give, the homework, the drills, make perfect sense. But that's not the way it works. Okay, this is the big war, basically. The view of grammar is very different in the two ways. As I've mentioned, in skill building, grammar is the cause. You study the grammar rules, practice them over and over again until they become automatic. For comprehensible input, grammar has a very different function. I want to give you the punchline before I go any further here. I'm not about to say that grammar is terrible. I will never say to teachers, teach grammar, go to jail. My punchline is, it's limited. It's hard to do. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's bad. Krashen says, don't ever teach grammar. No, not true. Here's how we think it works. Our fluency in language comes from what we've acquired, and a great deal of our accuracy, most of our accuracy. So acquisition is responsible for coming out with a sentence in another language. The easy way to get the feeling for this is an easy example for you guys. What a great audience. Think about one of your many languages that you're kind of low intermediate in. You've all got one, right? Okay, Greek, right? Okay. Where you can kind of get through a conversation, but there are things you don't understand, etc. So you're having a conversation in Greek. You're about to say something. The sentence pops into your mind from what you've acquired. All the grammar rules do really only one thing for you. They act as a monitor or an editor. So here's how it works. You're about to say something in your intermediate language. Just before you say it, you scan the sentence internally, you think of the rules that you studied, and you make corrections. Or you blurt it out, you realize you made a mistake, and you go back and correct. This is what we think is going on. Now, if you want to see the research on this, there's a book I highly recommend, published in 1981 by me. And you can get it for free. It's free. Okay, it's on my website. It's called, the title is Second Language Acquisition, Second Language Learning. The subtitle is The Cure for Insomnia. If you can't sleep, I really recommend this book. I mean, it's fascinating to like the 2% of the population who think this is really interesting stuff. Okay, but there it is. So it's long out of print, but you can free download it and other books on the website. And that's where the research comes. Before I tell you more about this, let me tell you what my thoughts were in 1975, when it first occurred to me that this is what was going on. You can now figure out how old I am. I'll tell you. I'm 76, but I read at the 80-year-old level. Okay. Anyway, here's what I thought then. 1975. We have acquisition, we have learning, they do different things. Acquisition, I decided then, gives us our fluency, and learning gives us our accuracy. Isn't that nice? Two components, two contributions. Obviously, we want both, so we want to include both in classes. We want conversation 2 days a week, grammar 2 days a week. Doesn't that sound fair? Doesn't that sound perfect? The truth must be somewhere in the middle. It turns out it's wrong. Since 1975, literally every day, the research has been telling me, and I'm restating what I did before, the action is here with acquisition. Acquisition gives us gives us fluency and accuracy, both. Even for the for the child, it's 100% acquisition. For the adult, even for the most analytic, grammar-loving adult, it's nearly all acquisition, okay? I want to tell you how hard it is to use conscious grammar. I'm going to give you the research results, and you will be appealing to your experiences, which is great. In order to use the monitor, 3 conditions have to be met, and the conditions are daunting. Condition number 1, you got to know the rule. Let me tell you how hard this is. Take your pen and draw a circle on your sheet about the size of a large coin. Okay, I'll do a little of this with you. Oh, I love chalkboards. Yes, this is great. Luddite. Let's say this circle represents all the rules of English. We'll use English as an example because there's been more study of English than of any other language. So this is a set, and it's a set of all rules. Let's say we go to the world's greatest syntactician, still Noam Chomsky, no question. And we say, Professor Chomsky, how many rules of English do you know, you and your pals? Well, Chomsky knows more about English than anyone who's ever lived, okay? So, but he's kind of modest about this. He says, well, we only know fragments, okay? But let's give him a lot of credit. Let's say Chomsky and his friends know that much about English, okay? So that's the first one. Let's do that one. Second, let's say now we've asked Professor Chomsky, we go to professional grammarians. Professional grammarians are people who write grammar textbooks. They don't know as many rules as Chomsky, because Chomsky's out there discovering new rules, but they read his stuff and they integrate it into the books. So how many rules do they know? Draw a circle representing, please do this with me, a circle representing their knowledge. Give them a lot of credit. Okay, let's go to another group. Grammar teachers. How many rules do the most fanatic, grammar-loving grammar teachers know? They don't know all the rules in the books, but they know a lot of them. So draw a circle for them. The next circle, all the rules the best grammar teachers teach. They don't know all the rules. They don't teach all the rules they know. The next circle, all the rules the best students understand. Finally, all the rules the best students remember. The little circle you've got in the middle is the limit of the conscious grammar for the best students we have in language classes. That's a severe constraint, and not everyone is that good at it. Okay, that's number one. Number two, you got to have time to apply the rules. You got to retrieve it, drag it up, put it in the sentence, etc. Let's pretend you are an intermediate student, low intermediate student of English as a foreign language or second language. And you have acquired things, but there's a lot you don't know. And you're having a conversation, and you want to use the rule for the tag question, which you've learned, but you haven't acquired yet. And here's what you have to do. You're about to come out with a sentence. Okay, John is a boy. You want to say, John is a boy, isn't he? Okay? Or Bella was wonderful, wasn't she? Etc. Okay, gosh, how am I going to do this? Let me look at the subject first. If it's a regular noun, you change it to a pronoun. If it's a pronoun, you leave it alone. Let's look at the verb. If it's a regular verb, you change it to a helping verb. If it's a helping verb, you use that. If the regular sentence is positive, you make the tag negative. If it's negative, make it positive. Then you change the word order. By the time you do that, your conversational partner is gone. Okay? Number three, you've got to be what we call focused on form. You got to be thinking about correctness. The grammar people think that one of the reasons we are here on Earth is to constantly monitor our language and know all the grammar rules possible and get corrected. There's another problem, that's it. There's another problem, though, that we have for many of us, me too. We like it. We like studying grammar. I admit, I have a PhD in grammar in Chomsky, okay? I think it's beautiful. My idea of a good time, find a grammar of a language I don't know, see how they do, or if they do, the subjunctive, I liked your presentation today. I just love going through all that stuff. It's great, Anyway, in fact, not only do we like learning it, but we like applying it. Every time I can, like in French, when you make the past participle agree with the direct object when it comes before la chose que j'ai prise. Every time I get that right, I rekindle the victory. And of course, I expect people around me to applaud. They never do. Isn't that right? Yes. No, that's not what I meant. Not what I meant. You have the same feeling. What we forget is that we are members of a lunatic fringe. Normal people get their pleasures elsewhere. Okay? I know I'm one of you. I understand this. There are a couple of important findings I'd like to put in, which will help us with the case histories. Language acquisition is gradual, not all at once. Very good research on this from the University of Illinois. A guy named Naj, he calls himself Nagy. I keep telling him it's Naj, dude. Anyway, Naj, Anderson, and Herman, a number of studies published in the Reading Research Quarterly, other top-notch journals generally filled with incomprehensible garbage, but in this case, good stuff. They looked at vocabulary development in English as a first language. And here's what they found. If you're reading along and you come to a word you don't know, and it's in context, you get a little piece of it. This all happens subconsciously. You don't even know it's happening. You get anywhere between 5 to 10% of the word each time you see it. There's a big amount of variation here, but that's about the average. This may not seem like much, but they calculated if people read enough, this is more than enough. They looked at what middle-class fifth graders read, about 1 million words a year, just getting 5–10% of the unknown words. You'll have vocabulary growth of several thousand words a year, which is what we find. We have replicated this for second language. Most contexts are friendly. A small percentage will misdirect you, but about 2/3 are friendly and a few don't make any difference one way or the other. So it is a gradual process. After a while, the meaning gets clearer and clearer and you're barely aware that it's happening. This is why, as we'll see later, it's a good idea, you don't know a word, not to worry too much about it. Because you're picking it up, you're picking up other things, etc. So that's interesting point number one. Number two, I mentioned that in order for comprehensible input to work, people have to pay attention to the input. So it has to be interesting. I think it has to be more than interesting. For optimal language acquisition, the input has to be so interesting that you even forget that it's in another language. It has to be compelling. That's for optimal language acquisition. So interesting, you're in a state of what Csikszentmihalyi calls flow. Great book, by the way, Flow by Csikszentmihalyi. Some of you are nodding. I'm not going to spell Csikszentmihalyi, but I can spell flow, okay? Anyway, he says when you're in a state of flow, what you're doing is so fascinating, your sense of self diminishes, your sense of time diminishes. Only the activity happens when you're reading a good book, when you're watching a good movie. Terminator 7. Yes, okay. Well, I think this applies to us, and what happens is people acquire language and they don't know that it's happening and they don't care that it's happening. We've collected a few case histories. I want to tell you about one. In our published version, this is with Christy Lau, my former student, it's about her son. We call him Paul in the articles. His real name is Vincent. Let me tell you about Vincent. Christy and her family live in the Bay Area, San Francisco. She and her husband are from Hong Kong, Cantonese, and her parents stayed with them for a while, so the household was totally Cantonese, and their boys grew up comfortably bilingual in Cantonese and English. When Vincent was a little boy, Mom and Dad were working really hard. They had occasionally had to hire babysitters. Babysitter would come over, turn on the television to Mandarin cartoons. I don't have to tell you, but I have to tell other audiences. Civilian audiences, right? That Mandarin and Cantonese are not the same language, okay? They're not like dialects of Chinese, okay? There's a certain shared vocabulary, but if you know one, it doesn't mean you know the other. It's a head start, you know, like Romanian and French, it'll be a head start, but it's certainly no guarantee. Anyway, she'd turn on these cartoons, and Vincent started watching them with his Cantonese vocabulary, the help of the caretaker, occasionally explain things, and the high quality of children's television. Are you aware of how good children's television is? Regular Show. Have you ever seen Regular Show? You know, I still like SpongeBob. What a guy. The nicest person, the nicest protagonist ever. And his friend Patrick Starr, the best friend anybody. I worry about Mr. Crab, though. You know, the restaurant's called the Krabby Patty, and they make crab burgers. And Mr. Crab is a crab. This isn't right. Okay, anyway. Anyway, the children's TV is just absolutely wonderful. I watch this stuff on airplanes even when my grandchildren aren't around because it's so good. Anyway, so he watched all these cartoons and gradually started to understand. Then elementary school, he started watching Mandarin TV for kids. When he got to high school, Dad would bring home 2 movies a week in Mandarin. The whole family would watch them. In the evening news with Grandpa, Grandma, the whole family. Today, Vincent speaks Mandarin. When guests come over and they're Mandarin speakers, no problem. They've gone to Taiwan, they've gone to Mandarin-speaking areas of China. He's very comfortable. The point is, Vincent doesn't care. Vincent had no motivation to acquire Mandarin. He still doesn't. He's not against it. He's not for it. He doesn't go for this, Hanban business that we're all Chinese, therefore, like they're doing in Singapore, all Chinese speakers have to do Mandarin, etc. No, it's fine. It's okay. He was interested in the stories. Acquisition of Mandarin was an accidental byproduct of hearing the stories and watching TV. I would like today to announce the end of the usefulness of the concept of motivation. We tell kids, you should really work on your French. It's going to help you someday. 9-year-old kid. They want to go skateboarding. Come on, no. Tell a good story and they'll be with you. Get them involved in good books, they'll be with you. It's the story that counts. This we want, our goal in all language situations is to find compelling input, and we'll see this is what our polyglots understand as well. And we certainly, Bella, the search there was for compelling input all the time. So when we go through the case histories, we're going to start with an ordinary one. I'm going to make the claim, prediction, and it's got to be right every time. Comprehensible input is the major source of language for these people. Grammar is not such a big deal. Either there's no attention paid to it at all, or it's quite peripheral. No forced production. The ability to speak is the result of acquiring language, not the cause. Correction, a little, sometimes, or none at all. Very compelling input. And many ways of making input comprehensible. Dictionary is not the only way. We'll see. People have different strategies. And they all exhibit patience. Okay? Very important. I'm going to start out with a non-polyglot case, just because I think it's a fun case. I got a call from a reporter from the Los Angeles Times about 10 years ago who said he was looking at cases of immigrants to the United States who came here young age, and they would not only pick up English, they would pick up other languages too, mostly people who worked in restaurants. And he invited me to come with him while he interviewed a young man named Armando, who was from Mexico, came to the United States in his teens, had been in the United States for about 10 years, limited education in Mexico up to 5th, 6th grade, which is normal, and was working in an Israeli restaurant in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And the claim was, he speaks Hebrew and English. Well, how did he do it? I had a nice chat with Armando. The thing about Armando that you get right away when you're with him, he's a really nice guy. He's very likable. You all know people like this. You're just with them, kind of like Steve, just easygoing, etc. Don't worry, it's not all going to be that way. How did he do it? He picked up Hebrew, he told me, by observing, listening to coworkers and friends. It took 2 or 3 years till he was comfortable with Hebrew, even though he was hearing it all the time. He never pushed himself. He never tried hard to speak Hebrew. He had lots of friends. He was friendly with the restaurant owners who were Israeli native speakers and spoke Hebrew all the time. Moroccan Israelis, okay? In fact, they liked him so much he got into an automobile accident, went to a local hospital. The restaurant sent over breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day he was in the hospital, okay? The customers, he got along with the customers. He got along with everybody. He got along with me. It was wonderful. He's never learned to read Hebrew, has never studied Hebrew, doesn't know anything about grammar. We had a conversation. I asked him and a friend of his to have a conversation about what they did yesterday, and I kind of, sat with them occasionally, pitched in. And I asked him afterwards, were you ever thinking about grammar? I noticed you got the past tense right there. He said, no, it just comes out the way it is. I don't know. Yes, he was corrected on vocabulary, never grammar. I tape recorded the conversation. Those days we used things called tape recorders. Ask your parents, they'll tell you. And I brought it to, in the same building was the Israeli consulate in downtown Los Angeles and the Israeli tourist office next to each other. I got 2 people to come out in the corridor with me and listen to this interview. And I said, what do you think of this guy? I got 4 evaluations. One said, the most negative was, he's pretty good. It's like he's been in Israel 2-3 years and he's getting, the everyday language really well. Another person thought he was Ethiopian and spoke Hebrew really well. Finally, someone else thought he was from Morocco and had lived in Israel for many years. The 4th person thought he was a native speaker of Hebrew. So we get the range from very good to native speakers. This is a nice case and goes right down the line. Okay, let's move into more exotic domains. Anthropologists have been telling us we need to look at other cultures, other groups. When you look at it, you find more evidence. The indigenous people of the Valpis River area, Valpis Basin in South America, very interesting group. This study was done in the 60s by a guy named Sorensen, and I haven't looked to see what's happened to these people if they're still in the situation they were in. About 10,000 people, 24 languages, not all related. They had a very peculiar rule. You can't marry anyone who speaks your first language. They considered foreigners to be incestuous. So kids growing up would have to pick up mom's language, pick up dad's language, and the lingua franca of the local community. And as the kids grew up, they gradually acquired more and more languages until in their teens, they suddenly started speaking these languages. Okay, this is going to sound like Armando once again. Quote from Sorensen. They do not practice speaking a language they do not know well yet. Instead, they passively learn lists of words, forms, phrases in it, familiarize themselves with its pronunciation. They may make an occasional attempt to speak the new language in an appropriate situation, but if it doesn't come easily, they will not try to force it. It takes from at least 1 to 2 years to learn a new language fluently. Correction, another anthropologist. It is rare for speakers to correct one another. And then it's usually only done with embarrassment. What do we have here? Same thing. We have no forced speech or very little, rarely corrected. Some conscious learning of the lists of words and pronunciation, but not of grammar. So this one is consistent. The next case threatened to be the counterexample that would bring an end to my entire career. It was announced by my chief rival at the time. I won't mention any names. Barry McLaughlin is his name. I kept this guy off the street, let me tell you. I gave him something to do for about 20 years, where he wrote article after article saying I was wrong, and I would respond, then back and forth. It was great. Anyway, one of the many things Barry said, which is wrong like everything else, some people develop high levels of competence without any opportunity for acquiring it. He just threw that out. And then it kept getting repeated, all right? Like fake news, okay? And the case that was brought up was Heinrich Schliemann. Have you ever heard of Heinrich Schliemann? Heinrich Schliemann was an archaeologist who claimed to have discovered the lost city of Troy. One of his biographers wrote a book called The Psychopathology of Heinrich Schliemann. So we have to take everything Schliemann said with a grain of salt. Anyway, the guy who wrote about him, Jeremy Hormer, said that Schliemann is one of these people who is counterexample to Krashen because he had no language acquisition. It was all conscious learning. All he said about Schliemann, this is the whole discussion, he mastered English in 6 months by writing, having corrected and memorizing essays while working as an office boy. So he'd write papers, have them corrected, and memorize them. That was it. This is all this guy did. Well, I had a week off, so what I did, I should have said I had a week off, so I learned to speak Italian. No, it didn't work. I went to the library, and I got all these books about Heinrich Schliemann, including Schliemann's autobiography. It helps to know other languages, written in German, all right? And you find things that really doubt that this is what happened. He did a lot of other stuff. Number one, he studied with a native speaker of English every day for 1 hour, and that included reading out loud. We don't know what else they did, but there might have been some comprehensible input there. He attended 2 church services in English every Sunday. Get this. He claimed to have memorized Ivanhoe and the Vicar of Wakefield. Can you imagine if some school person discovers this and this becomes part of the curriculum? Okay. He said all he had to do was to read something 3 times, and he had it. He could memorize 20 pages a day. He said he devoted every spare moment to language study, reading and memorizing on errands and while waiting in line. One of the people who looked at his work said during that time he pumped in about the equivalent of 7 years of formal study of language, about 1,300 hours. Not all comprehensible input, in fact, pretty low quality, but 1,300 hours, you're going to get something out of that. Also, no one gave him a test after 6 months. We don't know how well he spoke English. This is just hearsay. Eventually, yes, even his critics said he was good at languages. But after that time, who knows what happened? I can't give you firm counter evidence that, he had all this comprehensible input, but it was a lot more than this one sentence. All right, Daniel Tammet. Anyone ever hear of Daniel Tammet? He wrote a book called Born on a Blue Day. Very interesting book, extremely interesting, very well written. Daniel Tammet, by his own description, is Asperger, suffers with savant syndrome, and he calls it, in his own words, an excessive need for order and routine. He has an extraordinary gift, ability with numbers and language. To raise money for charity, he memorized pi to 22,000 places. That's number 4 in the world. I think this is such a waste of time. 3.1415926589793238846. That's 20. If you do that, you can get on a website, which is good for your career, okay? Anyway, we all did that in high school. I went crazy with this. The world record in pi is 60,000. Daniel Tammet's number 4. He holds the British and European record. Oh my goodness. Well, Sparely, he claims, and I believe him, no reason not to, that he's good at 10 languages, but it's clear that he used both learning and acquisition, probably in equal amounts. Here's Lithuanian. While he was working as an English teacher in Lithuania, he hired a teacher. I wrote words down as I learned them to help me visualize and remember them, conscious learning, and I read children's books, acquisition. Icelandic. He did Icelandic in 10 days and then had a conversation in Icelandic on television, okay, the end of that. He read texts out loud so his teacher could check his pronunciation, conscious learning. But, quote, the large amounts of reading helped me develop an intuitive sense of the language's grammar, acquisition. He also says, when I'm learning a language, there are a number of things I consider essential. A good-sized dictionary, but also a variety of texts. I prefer to learn words in whole sentences to give me a feeling for how the language works. Similar with Welsh, lots and lots of grammar, lots and lots of input from reading and from newspapers. He has a teaching method on his website, and it is grammar-based, but includes some acquisition. So are we to conclude from Daniel Tammet that the optimal path is both systems? No. Maybe it only works if you can memorize pi to 22,000 places. Maybe it only works for people with these special abilities. Okay, I'm going to do 2 people together here, Lom Kato and Steve Kaufman, who are the hyper-polyglots I know the best. I met Lom Kato, Catherine Lom, in Budapest, 22 years ago. I was giving a short course in Page, a city about an hour by train from Budapest. And after I'd been there about a week, one of my students said, while you're here, You really should meet Lomkato. She's a national treasure. She's the world's greatest polyglot. She speaks 17 languages, okay? And if you want to meet her, you better hurry. She's 86 years old. Okay. So I said I would love to meet her. So my student called Lomkato and said, Professor Krashen is here from California. And Lomkato said, so what? And he would love to meet you. So I took 3 trips into Budapest to meet with her. Magic. She really spoke these languages, no kidding. We spoke English. Her German is better than mine, was better than mine. Her French was better than mine. Her Spanish was better than mine. Every language I knew, she knew better. And her English was really, really excellent. She grew up in Budapest, monolingual Hungarian. She got her languages after she finished her PhD in chemistry from the University at Page, where I was. She started out by doing French, then added English. She was teaching French, going 1 lesson ahead of her students, etc. She basically did it on the job as a professional interpreter and translator and went after language after language. Her core method she called the core novel. She would get a book written in the other language and read it thoroughly until she knew the whole thing pretty well. I told her what we were doing, reading lots and lots of easy stuff. She says, oh, I wish I could have done that. Absolutely, but this is all that was available. She said that she did Russian during the Nazi occupation of Budapest when it was forbidden by law to speak Russian on the streets. You're under penalty of death. She and her husband moved into an apartment that had been abandoned by a Russian family, and they left behind stacks and stacks of romance novels. She said, this is where my Russian came from. Now that's a contrast with Steve, who has also a late starter, did not grow up with lots of languages here in Montreal, in the English side. I had a similar experience. I grew up in Chicago, and I took French in high school, and we were never told that French was spoken in Canada. It did not, I found out years later, no kidding, okay? Anyway, I did take French, by the way, and my experience was kind of like yours, only a little worse. I was given a passing grade after 2 years of French by a very kind teacher who didn't want to spoil my record, under the condition that I never study French again, and that his reputation wouldn't be ruined. Okay, it was all grammar, of course. Anyway, eh bien non, je parle français très bien. On m'a dit que je parle français comme une vache espagnole. C'est bien, oui. Okay. Anyway, Steve had a different experience in some languages. If you read his book, you'll see that he lived in France for 3 years. He worked in Japan for several years, has traveled a great deal, has worked in these languages, done business, lumber industry, diplomatic service, etc. They have similar comments, though, about immersion, about living in another country. People say, you want to learn the language, go to the country. You want to learn to speak Spanish, go to Mexico. No, bad idea. If you don't know any of the language, you won't understand anything, okay? I'll tell you my experiences with Mandarin. I got invited to go to Taiwan, first in the year 2000, to give a lecture. One of my former students invited me. And then after I gave that, I got other invitations, etc. And I went to Taiwan at least once a year for the next 10 years. I'm going back again in a couple of months. And thanks to my student, her husband, their kids, I really know a lot of people. By the way, I'm master of the MRT. I know all the stops, how to get off, etc. After, I would say, the equivalent of 3 months of being in Taiwan, if you pile it all together, the only thing I could say and understand in Mandarin was, Wuxi wan bing xi ling. That was it. I like ice cream, which is not a bad thing to know. I then took a class in 2007 using a method based on stories, comprehensible input. My teacher was Linda Lee, and we're still friends, still working together, sort of. The first 10 minutes, no, first 5 minutes, the first minute, I got more comprehensible input in that class than I did all that time in Taiwan, because none of it was comprehensible, obviously, okay? So the beginner belongs in a language class, or as Steve has recommended and as LangFest recommends, set it up yourself. Do it at home. Steve recommends doing that even if you're in the country and especially if you're not in the country. And they give similar reasons because LangFest, when you're abroad, especially as a tourist, it's difficult to make the acquaintance of someone patient, intelligent, and available enough to help you practice your skills, etc. You can achieve the same results really better at home. And Steve Kaufman says, create your own language world, a world of meaningful language for listening and reading. So that's number one. They have the same view of immersion. So going to the country is fabulous for intermediates, when you can start to understand it, but not for beginners. Both talk about the importance of compelling input in my terms. Kaufman says we can only learn to use a language from interesting and meaningful content. We should allow students to choose subjects familiar and of interest to them. He says when taking a Mandarin class, which he did in Hong Kong, the best times were when we had lunch and we all got to talk, the teachers, and we talked about our lives, experiences, etc. LangFest talks about the same thing, getting in a state of flow from reading, and does it very eloquently. When you read, a character's fate becomes the reader's fate. Genuine readers sail with Robinson Crusoe, throw themselves under the train with Anna Karenina, die of tuberculosis with the Lady of the Camellias. Afterward, luckily, they come back to life. She says she made sure she got compelling input. Whenever she bought books, she bought two. One of them would be more comprehensible and interesting. Don't take any risks, etc. Both put skill building in its place, grammar study. Steve writes, occasionally I consult grammar books. Sometimes the explanations help, but other times they didn't. I would usually remember grammar rules or explanations only for short periods of time and then forget them. Thank you for saying this in public, Steve. That has helped so many of us. Okay, oh gosh, I can't remember. There's something wrong with me. In the end, it was only through enough exposure to language that my grammar improved. Steve wrote, I deliberately ignored explanation of the theory of Chinese grammar because the theoretical explanations sometimes made no sense to me. Me too. PhD in grammar, sometimes I have no idea what they're talking about. I knew with enough exposure they'd start to seem natural. LangFest, what lets you avoid mistakes is not memorize laws of grammar, but the right form seen, heard, she says said, put a question mark. To such an extent it becomes second nature. Steve again, do not spend your time in a vain attempt to master the language from grammar rules and word lists. You will not enjoy this tedious form of study, and it will not work. LangFest has a very nice quote. Pursuing books, no wait, that's not the one. Oh, many excellent philologists who with impressive confidence in the most abstract realms of a foreign language need an interpreter to buy a streetcar ticket or order lunch. Let me read to you from a letter published in the London Times in 1950 something, okay, a long time ago. August 29, 2002. Man writes in, when my wife, O-level French, fail, happily bargains in French market stallholders, I, 1953, A-level French pass, only stand by muttering, no, tomatoes are feminine. You should be using the subjunctive. I was even able, when paying the bill at a small hotel, to say beautifully and accurately in French, had we not been awoken at 3 a.m. by the dust cart, it would have not been necessary for us to have raided the minibar for a bottle of water. Unfortunately, I had to rely on my wife to understand the reply. Sorry, it's still going to cost you 50 francs. So, not the root. Correction. Here, LangFest confuses me a little. I wish I could still chat with her. Oh gosh, one of my great honors. The two greatest honors I've had in my life. This is the big one. The second one was having lunch with Stan Lee, the inventor of Spider-Man. Whoa. Okay. You watch the Marvel movies? There's always a cameo, Stan Lee. What a guy. Anyway, that's another lecture. Anyway, the other is, of course, being with LangFest and being asked to write something at a celebration of her life, her 100th birthday. Correction. What about being corrected? LangFest says, correction can make you sick to your stomach. She recalled one situation as an interpreter. Now, she had a PhD in chemistry, and in this instant, she made a mistake, a slip of the tongue. Instead of saying inorganic, she said unorganic. She said, my chief rival haughtily corrected me. I was lost for the rest of the day. Now, if this happens to Lom Kato, what about 9-year-old kids in classes? On the other hand, she says, uncorrected mistakes are very perilous. You keep repeating the wrong formula, they take root in the mind, and we accept them as authentic. I don't think so. I think if you get more comprehensible input, they gradually go away. Do you have to know every word when you read? I wrote a paper last year, worked on to give a presentation called Regression to Skill Building, how all of us forget the theory of comprehensible input, and we go back. When I'm reading in French, German, Spanish, etc., I don't look up words. I just keep going. No problem. If I can't read the book, if it's too hard, I'll read something else. And vocabulary still grows. Reading in Mandarin, I still want to look up every word. I fight the impulse, okay? Because the texts are harder for me. Steve says, you can expect to forget whatever you look up in a dictionary pretty quickly. I heard Steve give a lecture where he says he looks up a word, by the time he gets back to the text, he's forgotten it. Ah, isn't that a relief? All right. Lom Kato, you don't need to know every word. You don't need to look up every new word. Don't get obsessed with words you don't know. Build comprehension on what you already know. Do not automatically reach for the dictionary. If you encounter a word or two you don't recognize, if the expression's important, it will come back. If not, there's no reason to worry about it. This leads to the issue of perfection, which all of us wrestle with. We're going to hear from Steve, from Lom Kato, and finally Laurence Olivier. Steve, I became fluent in French by giving up the traditional approach of trying to perfect my grammar. Perfection didn't matter anymore. Only communicating did. I no longer disliked language learning. I read what I liked, even if I didn't understand it all. I spoke with people who interested me. Don't try to achieve perfection, which is vanity. It will hinder your progress. Seek to enjoy yourself. Your improvement will be constant, though uneven. This next quote from Steve is a big one and stunned me when I read it, and I realized how I'd been suffering by not understanding this. Other people don't care if we're perfect. Here it is. You will often feel you're struggling when in fact you're communicating quite successfully. The key to successful communication is to try to relax, enjoy the experience, focus on the meaning you're trying to communicate, not how well you're doing. Do not think your grammar and pronunciation are being judged. Your listeners want to understand you. Pretty heavy, huh? Lom Kato, if you feel you must speak like a native, you will be inhibited. Language is the only thing worth knowing even poorly. Isn't that wonderful? Propagation of half-truths is not an advancement of science, but a hindrance. For the language learning, however, it would be a pity to fall silent because he or she doesn't know with certainty whether a form will hit home or not. One of the few things that was good about the last Star Trek show, Enterprise, which I thought was horrible. It was like written by 6th graders who were not quite, normal. There's this one episode where the lieutenant in charge of translation, the communication officer, the translator has not yet been built, the universal translator. And this enemy vessel or threatening vessels is after them, and she's trying to figure out how to respond. And she's got all these charts and verbs, and she's saying, well, let's see, I don't know what the past tense of this is. And how do I do? And the captain says, just say something. They're going to destroy us, and they're going to go destroy Earth. She says, yeah, but I can't worry about the subject-verb agreement. I don't know if this is correct. She says, just do it. She does it, and of course, saved. There it is. We can save the universe by not being perfectionist. Laurence Olivier, in a wonderful book, it's called The Ultimate Seduction. I highly recommend it. It's from a quote by Picasso. Work is the ultimate seduction. Discussion with Laurence Olivier, don't waste your time striving for perfection. Nobody will notice when you achieve it. Striving for perfection is the greatest stopper there is. If you do, you'll be afraid you can't achieve it. And if you achieve it, you'll be afraid you can't achieve it again. It's your excuse to yourself for not doing anything. Instead, try for excellence, doing your best. Don't let your high standards trip you up. Great therapy for me. Okay, next final thing. Is there a gift for languages? I took advantage of my relationship with Lomkato. When I met the linguists in Hungary, I was invited to the university to talk to the languages department, etc. And I told them in casual conversation, I've been hanging out with Lomkato, I get around, man. And everybody said, oh, she's got a different brain. She's just different. None of them had ever met her or studied her. All these people involved with language pedagogy, etc. I asked her about that. She said, not at all. She just knows how to do it. And there's another factor. The duration and intensity of activities in language is what is crucial, not a mystic gift for languages. A gift for language is not a matter of intellect, but of character. Self-confidence and openness. Steve, I think, comes closer. In fact, the successful foreign language speakers take for granted that they'll have to communicate in another language. And don't think it's unusual. It's natural. They accept the fact that they were born with the ability to acquire another language. And that's what you guys have, most of you have succeeded. Well, also, I think you have to know how to do it. Steve also had the benefit of something I think is increasingly important, the concept of language parent. I wrote a short article on this, on language parents. It was suggested by a buddy of mine in New Zealand who said that when he went to China and did martial arts, he made friends with another Kung Fu student and who was a native speaker of Chinese. And this guy spoke a little slower, was interested in what he said, didn't correct his errors, and they became buddies. It is the transition. When you get to the environment, it's good to find people like this. Steve tells us his language friend was the Japanese commercial officer, Nick Yazaki. He expressed himself in a careful, painstaking way that helps so much and was long-winded. It's great. My language friend in Austria, I was a music student in 1962, before your mother was born, in Vienna. I went to study piano, and I didn't do very well in piano. I had this real problem with my teacher, but I did great in German. That kind of changed things. Anyway, my landlady, my Hausfrau, Frau Novak, loved to sit and gossip. And I thought she was very old, like probably 60, okay? And she always repeated the same stories, which were wonderful for me. And I really enjoyed having tea with her 2-3 days a week. She was my language parent. She also got me into great literature. Those of you who know German, Karl May, Winnetou, junk. Pure, total junk. It was wonderful. I recommend junk. Lots of easy stuff that's so much fun, you feel guilty reading it. When I was in Ottawa, University of Ottawa, I made friends with a member of the French department who never spoke English to anybody. And we used to get together on the weekends and take our kids roller skating across the river in Hull. He was my language parent in French. My language parent in Spanish has disappeared. I don't know what to do. As you can tell, I work out at Gold's Gym in Venice, California, where Arnold trained. Okay? And I don't look big because it's my day off. Okay? And one of the people working there, sweeping the floor, they're mostly Mexican Americans and Mexicans who do the work there. And I talked to them, and I met this lady named Emma. Emma was just wonderful to chit-chat with. I started just chatting with her about a year ago. And, we spoke Spanish. Turns out she doesn't speak English. And I found the topic of mutual interest, our children and my grandchildren. We just went on and on. It was really great. And she said, thanks for talking to me. Nobody does, etc. Got there last week. She's gone. I have to track her down. She was wonderful. A language parent is that bridge that can help you. And I think many of you are thinking of who your language parent was. Last page. I thought we'd stay till around 9:30. No, that's when. So let me come to some conclusions with all this after it's all well and done. This is on the table, on the bottom. And this is a partial summary of what I've said. We have all these people who did different things. Some got corrected, some didn't. Schliemann got corrected. Lomkato sometimes got corrected. Some of them studied some grammar. Schliemann studied a lot. Daniel Tammet a lot. Some didn't. Two of them for sure did not speak until they were ready. The rest of them we don't know. What they all had in common? Comprehensible input. That's it. That has to be it. Now, again, I'm going to conclude by saying, when you write your case history, and I hope you do, I'm going to be in trouble if it doesn't come out. But that's how it goes. Science is a dangerous game. So far, over the last 40 years, it's been okay, but I'm waiting to see the rest of it. So please help me out on this. Thank you very much.
I'm going to do a quick picture.